You are listening to Build What's Next Digital Product Perspectives. I'm your host, Josh Lucas, and at Method, our vision is to connect technology with humanity for a simpler digital future. Join us as we speak with leading experts to discuss industry trends, best practices, and emerging technology that can help you and your organization craft better digital products and experiences. So hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Build What's Next Digital Product Perspectives. I'm excited for you to hear from our guest here today. My name is Josh Lucas, and I'm sitting down with Keirsey. Now, Kent, I'm going to give you a second here to give us your backstory, but I just want to let folks know you are the founder and CEO at Invoke, the platform for creative AI image generation. And you are also the founder and advisor of Product ATL that brings together the product experts from across the Atlanta area. And we've at Method have had the good fortune of getting to work with you a little bit earlier on with some of that, and have partnered with Product ATL and Product Coffee down there with a number of things. And so super excited you're here. You are on site today to deliver a tech talk for us, which is, I sit in on a lot of these podcasts, and a lot of times talking with some very smart people who are talking about some very heady subjects that I'm trying to keep up with. This one, fortunately for me, is something that I actually am involved in and get to nerd out on a lot. Yeah. So I enjoyed this one, a little bit more than the usual today. But you were here talking with our group about what you're doing at Invoke, but also what are some of the other things we need to be thinking about when it comes to Gen AI in multiple levels. But I'll let you kind of jump into that in a second. But first, can you give us, I guess the reason I bring that up is in case people like what they're hearing here. We're going to have that tech talk available. They can jump on YouTube, hear maybe a little bit different context of some of what they're going to hear in our interview here today. But can you give us a little bit of a backstory? How did you get into this world? Tell us a little bit about Invoke and what you guys are doing there. But how did you find yourself in this situation doing this type of work?
Oh, that's a great question. A series of fortunate events.
Yeah.
I have been in product for almost a decade in Atlanta, and have been just one of those people who's always interested in the technology, interested in what's coming next. Probably am the kind of person who predicts we're going to see self-driving cars 10 years before they actually happen, right?
Yeah.
So I was maybe 2014, 2015, I was absolutely sure self-driving cars everywhere in the United States by 2020.
Hey,
and obviously way wrong.
Shameless plug. The podcast we just let out was with Josh Beatty, who works on autonomous vehicles with Toyota.
Oh, very cool.
Go check that out.
Yeah, very cool. I had the chance to drive in one in San Francisco. I did a Waymo. And honestly, I feel like unless you have really lived that experience, you can't really imagine what it's like to have the car drive itself.
Oh, yeah.
But when it happens, you're like, I'm sold. Sign me up. I will do this anytime. It was magic.
That's what everybody says that I've talked to. I've not had the luxury of doing it, but everyone loves it.
It was super cool. But, we'll kind of focus maybe less on the past and more on Invoke. I think it was August 2022, the Stable Diffusion model was released. And Stable Diffusion, for people who aren't aware, is an open source model that is really focused on image generation. And, I stumbled on a post that was talking about it. I have a decent computer. I'm a nerd. I play video games. And so I was like, hey, I can run this. And, found a repo that was started by the head of adaptive oncology at the Ontario Institute of Cancer Research. So he's a kind of long-time hacker, but works on cancer research, does machine learning stuff. And he had written a command line interface script that let you run the Stable Diffusion model. And I was like, oh, that's cool. I'll just hop on that repo, pull it down, and play with it. And it really became this center of gravity for a lot of people who are really interested in the technology and also wanted to build something. And so very quickly, the repo started getting new features, and this was very rapid moving. I mean, I think the first model was August 22nd, 22, and 7 days later there was a paper that was released that allowed you to create embeddings for Stable Diffusion, and what that means is kind of redefine how you're prompting the model and really refining that to map to your language. And that was 7 days after the model was released. That type of big advancement was coming out, and that pace did not stop. And so this group of people is just, trying to make all of this keep up with what was happening in AI, keep up with the pace. And me being a product person, just kind of there and very interested and, a little bit tech savvy, contributed, helped build the community, helped kind of grow it and really think about like, what is our purpose? What are we trying to do with this? Who are we focusing on? And very, very early on in the project, we decided, we think that this can be a tool that can empower creatives and empower artists and really be a part of their toolkit rather than something that replaces them. And so that's really been the driving force from the very early days. And this was when it was just open source. And I think it was maybe 3 or 4 months later, which is about 300 years in AI time. We started the company because we saw an opportunity to really enable the work that we did in open source by building a business around serving larger scale companies who needed this type of image synthesis and didn't have the capabilities to deploy it, didn't really understand what was happening from a legal risk and compliance perspective, and really in a lot of ways just need a usable way to get this technology out to their teams. And so we solved that problem in a really nice way. We follow kind of what is known in the ecosystem as an open core model, which means the core of what we do is open. It is completely permissively licensed. It's Apache 2. You can build on it, hack on it, use it however you want. And what we do is we really solve a lot of the problems that enterprises face at scale. And that has been kind of the journey is, starting the company, bringing a lot of the early team on. So early maintainers, Dr. Lingenstein is an advisor to the business. He still actively contributes.
Oh, nice.
We talk to him all the time. We've got a few folks that are in the gaming industry who are advisors. And then, a lot of the team actually came from the early open source enthusiasts, the people who were just building. We have a team member who's who's in Toronto and one who is in Australia. And I think that we started as a remote company because we evolved out of the open source project. And so we've just stayed that way. But time zones don't stop us. We work on this incessantly and passionately. But that's kind of how we got to where we are now. As of January, we launched our enterprise product. We've been actively onboarding enterprises. We have some of the world's largest gaming publishers. We're working with VFX studios. Stuff that you probably are seeing is kind of incorporating this technology, and we're one of the kind of providers of that behind the scenes.
Yeah. Is there any fun stuff you're allowed to talk about?
No.
Yeah. That's the beauty of a lot of what we do is hey, you interact with stuff we've built every day, and we can't tell you what it is.
Yeah. It is fun, and we're looking at figuring out ways that we can engage with some of the artists that we work with on a regular basis and kind of give them a platform to share their experience, because I think that's something that is really missing right now. Is there's a lot of dialogue from people who don't like the technology, don't like the change, and want it to stop, want us to go back pre-AI. And there are a number of people who use the technology, really see what its potential is, but feel uncomfortable talking about it as a vocal champion, right?
Well, and that might be a good place for us to really dig in, because in your tech talk and also in conversations we had in preparation for this, we talked a little bit about this idea. You reference there's a lot of people on both sides of the fence. Some people think that AI is going to come in and replace all of our jobs, and it's going to do a lot of bad things. And there's other people who think that it's going to fix all the problems we have, right? But as we were talking, I like where you were directing the focus, which was AI isn't meant, and this was specifically as it relates to creative content generation, but it's not meant to replace the artist. It's meant to be. It's most effective when it is used as a tool in the artist's toolkit.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that and kind of give people a little bit more context so they understand kind of to what level or what role does AI play in from an artist perspective in your mind?
Yeah, and I mean, I think, it's always easy to map this back to like a practical use case, which is like how am I actually doing something as an artist? What project am I taking on? Typically in a professional organization, let's say game studio, you have an objective, right? You have a creative brief. This is giving us guidelines on what we're trying to create. There are some guidelines already. There's things that we're trying to adhere to from a style perspective. Typically most game studios, they kind of like work through a couple of different styles before they really land on this is the aesthetic of the game, and now everything that we do needs to map to that aesthetic. Well, the artist has to go in and figure out, okay, I'm being faced with this challenge. I'm, creating a new skin for a character, right? Like one thing that's really popular right now is live ops games where game is free to play. You have like thousands, hundreds of thousands of people playing it, and you make money by selling like, cosmetic, aesthetic type stuff in the game, right? Well, when they're releasing content, they're thinking about, okay, how do we make that different from what's in the base game? How do we make it different enough that it's interesting to people? How do we make it thematically consistent with this like next batch of content that we're
so I'm
putting
not
out?
just coming in and making something that totally doesn't fit the aesthetic, right?
Right, exactly. And so that's what the artist is trying to figure out is like, how do I map new to old? How do I make these things integrate well? And how do I adhere to this broader initiative that we're doing with this next set of content? And an example might be, we're trying to do, let's say, an underwater themed next like batch of content. It's all going to be underwater. And so now we need to have all of these characters in some form of like aquatic vibe, right? We've got to come up with that. Well, what an artist is going to do is they're going to say, okay, this is the core character we have. We're going to come up with 8 or 9 different concepts of ways that this character could be modified to be aquatic. And they'll go in and they'll sketch that out, right? And they'll come up with 9 of those. And then you have it go back to a team, and the team's looking at those 9, and they're like, that guy's head is super cool, and that shoulder pads there, we like those. The legs on this one, wow, best legs ever, right?
Yeah.
Whatever it is, you're kind of like Frankensteining the concept together, and then the artist is like, okay, this is what's really connecting. I'm going to go take that, and I'm going to composite that into a new concept. Well, that process, like historically, can take 5 weeks to make just one skin, right? And that's like you come up with the sketches, you go through and you kind of paint it out, and you get a lot of back and forth feedback on, don't like that, do like that, try this, try that, because you've got an art director who's managing a team of artists who are going out to do this stuff. Well, with tools like Invoke, you see that back and forth process happen a lot more quickly. You have a conversation that's a lot more coherent because you're able to articulate, as an art director, for example, you can say, hey, these are a couple of concepts that I think really map like aesthetically to what we're doing. And they can actually show the other artists on the team, this is what I'm thinking, right? Because it's a visual communication tool. Now I don't have to just like use my words to describe to you what I'm trying to go for, and then you have to go based on just my description. Yeah, you're the interpreter.
Right.
I can show you. I can say, okay, AI. This is my prompt, right, for the AI, and I, as an artist, I can see 6 of those and say, of these 6, this is the one that we should really kind of like strive towards, because now we've got like a visual medium that we can point to that's really easy and cheap to iterate on, and then the artist can actually go in and use their sketches. Pass those in and get to that final result a lot more quickly. So what that means is you now have the same result in less time. And this is a conversation that we have a lot with our customers, which is, what are you going to do with that time? Are you just saying we got to the result and now we're done? We did it in a day instead of 4 weeks, and now we're going to just say like, okay, that's it?
Yeah.
Or are you going to reinvest some of that time and give yourself more options? Are you going to do more with the time, right? And I think that's where most people are leaning right now, because it's very competitive out there, especially in like media. You've got to compete by quality. You've got to be different, right? And so more options give you the ability to compete. They give you the ability to evaluate what really resonates. It allows you to test more and experiment more. And I think that's where, when you watch the dance of an artist using these tools, it's not that they're putting in a prompt and getting a picture and saying, I'm done. you can now pass in things like a sketch, have it help you finish that sketch. You can take that and work that into your process in Photoshop so you're compositing things together. It's really much more of like an element of injecting language and kind of your creative goals into a process that can realize those really quickly, but you're still composing that. You're still compositing it. You're still orchestrating a lot of the actual creative decision making in order to get to a good spot. Because if you don't have that skill, if you don't have any sense of like color theory or artistry or like the rule of thirds and composition, you're going to make something that doesn't look good, right? You still need those artistic skills in order to produce something that's worth looking at.
Yeah. And so as you're getting into that, like, is it fair to say, and maybe I'm just rephrasing some kind of how you were just putting it, I see it almost as like a digital artist in a lot of ways becomes more of a sculptor. Like you're more of a potter in a way, like you're shaping it, you're kind of molding it, but you can't do that without having first that, like to your point, that base understanding of like, here's what looks good, here's why this has to be consistent, but you get into a lot of the training side of it, right? And that was to me the big thing where it's like that's where it gets super interesting, because I think as we've looked at a lot of these platforms, Midjourney is one that's out there. I think a lot of people are probably very familiar with, and we get most of the time, at least early on in the process, people are just like, I just want to type something in and see what you can make me, and maybe I'll get lucky and it's good enough I can use. Okay, and maybe you do get lucky. But if you want something that's going to consistently roll out imagery and content that feels ownable, that has your brand fingerprint on it, there's got to be a training element. And that was always the thing that seemed like it was, not that it was out of reach, but it's like, man, this seemed way more complicated than it needs to be right now. And one of the things that you and I were talking about was that's part of the magic of what you guys do, is like we make the training part easier, we make it more accessible so that you can get to your end result faster. So what does that look like? Because I think for the folks who maybe aren't familiar with that part of it, that could be a total like black hole.
Yeah, so I'll try to simplify it so that we're not getting into like the weeds of machine learning. The way that I think about these models that have come out is, they're typically referenced as foundational models, and that's because you're taking this model as a foundation and building on top of what is inside of it. So it's developed an understanding of what cats look like and mountains, and it's basically become a dictionary. It's like the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and every single word has a meaning associated, a visual semantic meaning. And that is like useful because now it understands common words, but it doesn't necessarily understand your language as an individual artist or as a company. It doesn't understand exactly what you mean. And when you're training, what you're doing is you're providing it visual examples and teaching it new language. And so an example might be, let's say you are making a movie. It's going to be like some next generation sci-fi opera movie. It's not Star Wars. It's the next thing, right? Whatever that is. Hopefully it comes soon. I'm waiting for it. But you come up with like a new character, right? And it's one of these like far-fetched alien characters. It's got a bunch of weird, like different decisions as far as how it looks that make it unlike anything that we've ever seen before. That type of character, you're not going to be able to really prompt for that. It's going to be very difficult for you to get that consistently. Like 4 fins on the head and whatever it is that you're going to use to describe it, it's going to give you something that matches that, but it's going to be very inconsistent and wildly different probably than what you had in your head. Training it would be, we've got, 5, 10, 25, 100 examples, however many you have, more the better. We're going to show it. This is this character, and we'll call him, for the sake of this, we'll call him Alien Gary, right? Okay, we're going to show this model what Alien Gary looks like, and we're giving it examples, and over the course of its training cycles, it's developing a relationship of, okay, when this user tells me Alien Gary, that's what it means. It means that, it's got the fins here, it's this color, and that's really where the training process is about defining your own visual language. And you can do this with anything. So a character's one example. You could put in concepts like visual expressions. I want to call this very specific expression. This is what it looks like. A style, right? Media, whatever it is, you're teaching it new words, and you're using that.
Well, and I think that the reason that I think this is so interesting is because when you do this the right way, and we'll stick with the character illustration, when you do this the right way, it allows you the flexibility of, hey, Alien Gary again, for example. Hey, I want him wearing this.
Right.
I want him posed like this.
Correct.
And so it's not the same figure, or the same product, fill in the blank. It's not the same thing that looks the exact same in every situation. Maybe you need something that looks like it's got a different label. It's got a different, you've altered your design slightly, and so you need to retrain it to do that. And so that's where it becomes interesting to me, because you start to see where it's less open-ended to the interpretation of AI, and instead you're using AI as that tool to refine. And now all of a sudden I'm taking this thing and I'm just placing it into the image that I want, or that I'm hoping to get, instead of hoping that this is going to interpret me properly.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what you're calling out is this notion of when a concept can generalize, or when a model can generalize, that means that you've taught it this concept that you want to provide outputs for in different contexts, right? Because we don't want to just put in 5 images and get those same 5 images out. It's not like we're going to ask for those same things again. We want something new. And so you're trying to teach the model what is consistent in every image when I ask for this, but give it enough variation that it learns how to put that in new contexts. So now I want Alien Gary on the beach. I want Alien Gary with a Mai Tai, right? He's like taking a vacation, right? That's what I want. Well, if it knows generic language and it knows Alien Gary, and now it can kind of compose those together, now you've got something that is useful, because you've taken that concept that you need and have placed it in a new context. And I think the example you gave of a product is a really great one, because when you think about any organization, really, I mean, we've seen automobile manufacturers use this. I think retail e-com is still a little early. They're like experimenting, but it's very, very hesitant early use. But you can think of when you're prompting for a backpack, let's say you're like an REI-esque company, you don't want just like any backpack. You want your product. You want the straps to be in the right spot. You want the label, the logo. I mean, that you'd make all those decisions when you're designing the product.
Well,
right?
and you get into such a level of granularity, because like I'm thinking, if I'm going and researching a product, and you're leveraging that as a marketing tool to describe to me what I'm going to get, I want to know, like, what kind of material is that, and is your AI generated imagery accurately reflecting all of those? Because if it's not, it's not useful yet.
100%.
Yeah.
And that's where training comes in, because it's really cool to take these mainstream models and get ideas from them, but it is not useful to take those and represent your products if they can't actually represent your products and what you're going to build. But when you train a model, you can say, like, here are 100 images of SKU 5577, right? And now it's like, oh, well, SKU 5577 is this specific backpack. It's got these straps here, and we've shown enough colors of it that now we can ask for it in black. And we haven't ever even made a black one yet, which would be an interesting decision. But let's say we never have. Because we've generalized that concept, it now can give us ideas of what that would look like black. And everything else is the same, but the one thing that's different now is color. And so this becomes a really interesting idea for a number of different applications, one of which obviously is very obvious, just using it for your e-commerce imagery and advertising. But it also is interesting when you think about, like, should we have a black one? Well, let's see what that would look like. Maybe let's do some focus groups and see if people like that color. Obviously, probably wouldn't do a focus group on black, but maybe we'll go with like day glow yellow or something that's a little bit more out there. It's like, do you like this in that color? Does this make you want to buy it more? And that type of control is really interesting to have when you're talking about that type of tool in an organization.
The other piece of this that I thought was fascinating is, and you can extrapolate this across different industries, but I thought it was super fascinating when you start talking about the idea of copyright. And that is something I know that is far from settled right now, but it's something that we're in this weird space right now with AI where there really aren't many rules yet, it seems, at least to the, to the everyday, the everyday user. But when you start digging into that, I thought it was fascinating to realize, one, how much we're still trying to figure out, but then two, can you expand on the idea of like what constitutes, like what do you have to have in order to have copyright as we think of it today, and is, like, when I'm going into Midjourney or I'm going into Invoke and I'm creating something that from a prompt, at what point, how much input do I need to have ownership over this? Because I think a lot of times we have people who are nerds about this and they already know where this is going, and then we have other people who haven't even thought about that as something they need to consider. So walk us through this.
There is so much that is, I would say, people just don't realize under the hood is important in all of this, that people just don't even look at, don't even think about. Copyright is one of them, licenses are the other, and we can talk about both. But for copyright, to answer your first question, we'll kind of go through what has happened so far, where are we, what open questions are there. The U.S. Copyright Office came back in late 22, early 23, and said, you do not get a copyright for AI-generated outputs. So this is just kind of like a blanket statement. You put a text prompt in, you get an output, whether that's text, whether that's video, whether that's image, there is no copyright. Why? The copyright law was put in place to protect human expression, right? And so the requirements for copyright, one of them, which really hasn't had to have been litigated too much in the past, I think there was one example where a monkey took a selfie, and the question was like, can you have a copyright on that? And I think the answer was no, because the monkey took the selfie. It's this crazy story. You can look it up. But we haven't really had this question of like, it's not human expression until AI, right? Where it became a really kind of like big problem to answer. Right. And the answer right now is if you put it in the text prompt, that's not enough human expression, that you have not controlled the output to a sufficient degree to merit copyright on that output. Now, that poses a lot of problems if we start talking about, okay, well, we can go use AI-generated content for anything because everybody wants protections. So there's a whole host of problems that it presents. I think the one that becomes really interesting is that we've moved beyond this kind of naive early implementation of, push a button, get output, to the point where we now can control it to an extent that I would argue, at least personally, is sufficient human expression to merit copyright. You can pass in a sketch and have the AI assist you in completing that based on your prompt. And, I presented this to one of the foremost legal scholars in the space, Matthew Sag. He's one of the professors at Emory, and he presented in, I think it was July, was on the Senate hearing panel and talked to the committee on this subject. And when I showed him that, he was like, very clearly that's protected by copyright. It's clear human expression. Whether that is a downstream protection because your original sketch has copyright and this is a derivative of that, or whether it stands on its own, TBD, but it's like clear enough that it's your human expression to say that's good to go.
So right? I've got two questions tied to that.
Sure.
Now, I'm sure there's a million more that spin off of this, but okay, so I ingest my sketch.
Sure.
And I start to refine it, I start to train it, and we get something that I like, right? This is my output. And we all agree, like, okay, that's protected.
Yep.
Now, from that, I then create 1,000 more, Are those other 1,000 protected because I made the one sketch early on?
Okay, so this gets into, I mean, this is, I don't know how deep you want to get into copyright law. I love it, so I'll go as deep as you want to go. This is where we start to get into derivative and transformative as key terms in copyright law. So there's the term derivative is effectively describing when you can clearly tell that it took inspiration and a lot of the core content of the human expression from a prior work. That is a derivative. And so an example of this would be, there was an Andy Warhol case recently. Andy Warhol had taken a photograph that a woman had taken of Prince, and he had made a kind of like a pop art looking series of Prince, or I don't know the medium, I can't remember, but it was effectively like the core visual element of that photo in a different style, and the kind of like, Andy Warhol style. And the courts came back and said that that was derivative and not transformative. And so this is a very key element of copyright law is, are you transforming the expression to be something else? Is it truly transformative, or is it really like the same thing in a different kind of like, wrapping paper, where it's just paper thin changes, right? To answer your question, I would say that those 1,000 other things that you generated, if they don't have any additional human expression, and if they are similar enough to the original to be derivative, then that's kind of like in the line there, they're derivatives. If they're just completely AI generated, like second order generations, where it's like you put in this and it kind of reimagined it a bunch of different ways, you'd probably argue that it's not insufficient human expression on the downstream stuff. And so it really gets back into this really fuzzy question, which is, where's the line of sufficiently different? And I mean, this goes into a lot of things with AI, because there is this push and pull of, so we've talked about this idea of I pass in a sketch and it helps me finish that out. Well, that's if I have the setting all the way up to replicate my sketch with highest fidelity, then it will do that. But I can, slide that down a little bit and give the AI a little bit more freedom, right? I can be like, okay, well, you got to kind of follow my suggestion here, but if you want to add like, different hairdo, or you want to throw in some different details, like, you got some freedom there to listen to my prompt.
Experiment a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like, it's this weird thing where you're kind of having this push and pull with the AI and seeing kind of what inspires you from what comes back. And I like that analogy you made earlier of like a sculptor, because I feel like really art has always been a little bit like that. Even when you're a painter, you're putting something out and you're kind of like, refining the structure of that color region, and you're really kind of playing with the shapes. So it's always been a little bit like that. And AI is just like another thing that you can add to that mix and really like pull and push it around.
So my second question is similar, and then we can jump to another subject here.
Sure.
But I am curious. So you're talking about how you need to show human expression at its origin in order to be able to protect it. But is there a point, or has there been a discussion around, do you reach a point where you have so much human expression through prompting that you reach a point where, like, well, you were massaging this for so long because you kept tweaking the prompt over and over and over and over until you got, like, do you ever reach a point where that in and of itself is considered human expression, or is it just a blanket no, that will never be enough?
It's a big debate right now. So there's a case that went through the Copyright Office. There was a gentleman who won, I think, some art fair prize. He won it using his Midjourney output. He did some touch-ups in Photoshop, but the Copyright Office said that those were de minimis. They basically were like, they don't matter. They're not material, right? And his argument, that I think the piece was Théâtre d'Opéra or something like that. You can look it up, but it's one of the earlier interesting art pieces that came out of Midjourney. His argument was that he did that he fought the prompt for hundreds or thousands of generations to get to just that one right concept. And the Copyright Office came back and said insufficient. It's not enough.
Okay, interesting.
Now, I think we could probably debate that, right? Like we could probably debate a lot of this. It's very up for debate. I think there's a couple of different examples. I mean, that's one case. I'm going to give you all of the cases that are interesting in this space and the ones that are still open. So the ones that have been settled, a woman, Chris Castanova, who now works at Adobe, I think. I don't know if she worked at Adobe when she did this, but she created through Midjourney a graphic novel called Zarya of the Dawn.
Yeah.
And Zarya of the Dawn, it was like a full graphic novel in panels, had captions, and she had a lot of the artwork. Now, the Copyright Office's response here, I think, is really interesting. They said that the art in that graphic novel, so any of the individual images, she does not have a copyright on that. However, she does have a copyright on the composition of Zarya of the Dawn. So the graphic novel, that art composited into the graphic novel, that she has a copyright over. Implications of that, what that means is if someone were to take an individual frame or a panel out of that and go sell that as prints, right? And sell that like as a tchotchke that you buy because Zarya of the Dawn becomes super popular and everyone wants to buy these like keychains or whatever. That image is not copyrighted. The individual frame is not copyrighted. She would have no like recourse for that. But nobody can go out and copy the entire graphic novel and sell the graphic novel because that is her human expression.
Yeah.
Which I think there's a lot to debate about that.
Well,
There's a
it's
whole lot
super
to debate.
fascinating, especially like if you play that out. Say Disney, for example, was like the first. I mean, Disney is one of the ultimate players when it comes to creating and licensing their characters and everything, right? Could you imagine if Frozen, if they didn't have the ability, I can't do anything with the entire movie.
Yeah.
But I can pull Elsa out and I can throw her into a greeting card or whatever, and that's mine now.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think about.
Well, it is. And I mean, I think this goes back to there's this fundamental question that we have to answer, which is, are we going to respect the process that goes into this? I think where in that process are we going to respect that it becomes human expression? Like, at what point does it become that? Because, right now we've been talking about I put all of this stuff in, prompts, images, all kinds of stuff, and then I get a picture out. But even then, that's not really that's not how artists are using this. So when you generate, you can go in and refine it. You can say, I want these parts to be regenerated. You can draw on top of it, have it reinterpreted. It becomes a very long process. And we've been doing this since the early days when we were open source, but we do a lot of these videos on our YouTube channel where we kind of show that process, that it is this iterative cycle. And I actually submitted something to the Copyright Office. I think this was early 2023. Showing to show that process, that there is this evolution, and that had its copyright rejected. And they what was the term they used? It was a drawn prompt is how they described my input.
Interesting.
Drawing and the iteration that I did. And so there's just this I think this stance that they have right now of they're not gonna land on protecting it because the moment they do, they've kind of set a precedent and they're going to get overwhelmed with just a bunch of people who will reach that line and start copywriting stuff. And I think that's probably the challenge right now is the Copyright Office as an entity is insufficiently staffed and organized to handle the amount of content that can now be generated with AI, right? Because the barrier to entry to create has been high until now, and now we have a much lower barrier to entry, and so that means more copyrighted things can be created wherever you draw that line.
Well, I want to pivot just a little bit.
Sure, let's pivot.
Because I can nerd out about just this one topic for way too long.
Yeah.
But from a business perspective, I think one of the things that a lot of people are saying, I think every company right now is trying to figure out how do we leverage, where are the appropriate spaces for us to leverage AI? Like what tools do we need to make us better at our job, to make us faster at our job, to deliver better value to our clients? And part of that discussion, I think, is going to involve what you were referencing earlier, which is like, where do you land as a company? And I specifically talking about the open versus closed models. And I was hoping you could recap a little bit about what those are and kind of how you see those fitting in to as a potential option for companies as they're trying to figure out like which of these avenues is right for us.
Yeah, so we'll kind of provide a foundational level understanding of these models. The models that people talk about when they're referencing AI, these are files, right? This is like a file that is anywhere from 5 gigabytes to like a couple hundred gigabytes. I mean, these are just like files that sit on your hard drive, right?
Well, and actually, I'm going to interrupt my own question here for 1 second, because this is the result of me being somebody who likes to use AI, but I don't know the guts of it super well. And so I love where you're going with explaining this. When we're talking about the file itself, like, how do you, like, when I'm throwing all this in, like, how is the file growing as it's learning? Is it's always staying the same? How is it not exponentially getting bigger and turning into this monster that just stretches across the internet?
Yeah, Skynet. Okay, so this is a good thing to parse out. I think people have this mental model of AI as this like being that learns, right? You interact with it and it learns from you. And that is more a function of how it's deployed by organizations than how this file, as it actually works in and of itself, operates. So if you think about this as kind of this big set of numbers, that's really what it is deep down in the core. Now, what those numbers do, let's not get into that because we're going to get into like high-level math. But it's this big set of numbers. And when it goes through the training process, it is kind of like fitting its understanding of the world into that very, very condensed set of numbers. And that is called training. You're updating the weights, okay, of the model, and that's what it does. When you are just using the model, that is called inference. It does not manipulate the model. It doesn't learn from anything that you've done. All you're doing is passing your input in, and it is providing an output, and that is inference. That is kind of using the model. What causes this kind of idea of it's learning is that most organizations then take those outputs and use that to help retrain the model. And so as an organization deploying this, it is a living, breathing model that is learning because the people at the organization are taking the outputs, feeding it back in, retraining it, and then releasing another version of the model. So version 1 came out, we used it for a week, we got a bunch of results, we updated it, now version 2 is out. And that is kind of what's happening. The frequency increases, as you can imagine, at like really sophisticated organizations where it's just constantly like learning. But that's what happens with these models. They're retrained on data. It's not like they're actually like learning as you're talking to them. Right?
Okay, gotcha.
But that's also the thing that's interesting is like, when you think about that and that it's this file that has this kind of very compressed set of information of learning inside of it, when you're using one of these models from a service provider, and that's what we typically refer to as a closed model, which means you don't have that file. You're not downloading the file and running it. You're hitting an API, you're calling out to that company, and they are running the model, running inference, and providing a response through the API. You never see the model, you never touch it. Most of the organizations that have closed models are training on your data. I ask a question, I get a response back. That is now in that training set that's going back through and retraining the model. So if you go in and you ask it like, hey, my social security number is this, and I want you to write it backwards for me. Well, now that is in the training data that's going back into the model. Maybe, probably unlikely, but maybe it's going to spurt out your social security number to somebody later on down the line. Now that's like a little bit of a hyperbolic example, but you get the idea, which is you're putting data out there and we don't know how it's going to come back out or be represented in that future state model. And if we are using it enough, maybe at scale, that could be a substantial part of its training data. And so maybe it really will kind of develop a better understanding of how we see the world, and maybe that's something that we want to keep proprietary, right?
Yeah.
Now, open models are a little bit different in the sense that an organization has trained the model, they've trained this file, and they are hosting it online for you to download and run, whether that's in your data center or on your local computer. That is Stable Diffusion. That's what is an open model that I'm referring to. That is something you download. It's about, I think Stable Diffusion 1.5 is maybe 2 gigabytes, and the latest version is maybe about 5 or 6. So these are like really tiny things that are very powerful given the size. You download that, and you are able to run that, and you can do whatever you want with it, right? You can take that model, you can run it on your hardware, you can train it, you can teach it your own thing. And that type of capability really allows an organization to inject more of themselves into the model, their perspectives, their content, their language, as I mentioned earlier, into the core fabric of the model. So you're not just passing it in as a prompt, which is what you're typically doing with something that's a closed model. You're taking a copy of the model and making it your own. And that level of investment, the amount of data that you're putting in, and from an operational perspective, if you're going to make that commitment to the point where you're investing that in, from an operational perspective, process for using these models, you're taking something and kind of making it critical to your business, you really want to be thinking about the long term. We're now taking a core value function of the business and relying on this model. Do we want that model to be someone else's model, or do we want it to be our own model, something that we own and kind of host and operate? And so that's one of the big differences between closed models and open models, is with an open model, you're taking it into the organization and really making it your own. Now, the licenses get complicated, and this is why I mentioned like licenses are super important, because they're probably the first thing that the average novice is just going to skip right over. It's like terms of service, except give me the model. Like, give it to me, right? Let's go play with AI. But the licenses are actually pretty complicated. There are a few out there that are really like permissively openly licensed. So Apache 2, I think Mistral, which is a French company, they've been making open models, and I believe theirs are Apache 2, which is like the openest of open model.
Yeah.
And then you've got organizations like Meta, Llama 3, surprise news, they just released Llama 3 today. Okay. So the latest and greatest model. If you go into that license, it is a proprietary Meta license. So you have to look at it and really understand what they're saying. But it's relatively open for almost everybody. The one restriction that they have, which is more of like a, we'll say like a little bit of a snub for all the other big tech companies, is if you have over 700 million active users of any of your products, you have to get a license from them to use Llama. Everyone else can use it for free. So like you and I can do whatever we want, right? We're going to be fine.
But hey, if you've got a big building down the street from us.
Yeah. A big old G or one of those other capital letters that's in the acronym. Yeah, it's interesting what's happening right now in AI. I think the argument from people, I mean, I went to an AI conference last year in the Bay Area, a lot of AI founders, a lot of VCs, and it's an active debate amongst that group whether this technology should be open or whether it should be closed. You have a lot of people who are, I don't want to like call them, I don't use a pejorative term, but like AI doomer, like this gonna everything's gonna devolve and society will collapse if these models are open. We've got to like really lock down AI. I think there's like certainly risks. I'm more in the camp of like, we're not there yet to the point where we need to worry about that. And we have a much more practical conversation of the impacts of AI on society that we need to address, rather than like AI is going to take over and like, turn us all into paper clips. Like that's like a little bit of the worry wart, I think, in the tech community. But, the debate rages between should this technology be open? Does that pose too great a risk? Does it pose too great a geopolitical risk, right? From a US-centric point of view, do we want everyone having our latest and greatest AI model if our biggest and best companies are releasing their great technology and making that openly available? Because it might not be reciprocated on the other side. And then on the closed side, you have people arguing that the access to this technology is going to be limited. We're going to be like centralizing power. We're going to be centralizing the ability to generate value in organizations that may not really care if they employ that many people to generate that value, right? So there's a lot of like societal level conversations right now that I think are being had, and there's not easy answers. But I definitely fall more on the side of worrying about it not being accessible and not being open, and making sure that people can use the technology.
Well, one of the things that sparked my attention as I was listening to you speak was the idea that we're already starting to see AI from a creator's perspective. We're seeing new tools as it relates specifically to video and video generation, and in some ways it's still fairly rudimentary. But the thing that I hear constantly is, today is the worst it's ever going to be. It will only get significantly better, significantly faster, right? So it's not going to be long before we're seeing huge visual strides with video. You've already seen some of them. But so the reason I bring that up is, as you were talking, it made me think about, it wasn't that long ago that you had 7 TV stations when you'd turn on, right? It wasn't that long ago that you had only a couple radio stations that you could get to listen to. And unless you had an expansive collection of vinyl or CDs or digital music down on to physically download, that's all you had, right? And then all of a sudden we have these streaming platforms start to be created. You have players like YouTube. You have the social media platforms that come up, and now all of a sudden you and I, who are nobody to anybody else in the world, have an opportunity to amplify our voice. The reason I bring this up, I find it super fascinating, is we are now living in a time where it's not going to be long before you start seeing that next type of evolution for filmmakers. Because that's kind of been the one that's always been out of reach. There's so much work that comes into creating full productions, and you can put whatever you want on YouTube, but you still got to be able to afford the equipment. You still got to be able to know how to do the lighting, to know how to properly do the audio, to know how to do the VFX if you even have the time to learn it. How long do you think before now all of a sudden we're going to start seeing feature films that, maybe not the whole film is there, but you have stretches of this film that are done that you and I right now can't do, but how long before we actually can start putting in Hollywood studio quality stuff into our home movies?
Weeks or months. We're not far from it.
Yeah.
We are very, very close to that. I think Sora, S-O-R-A, is an open AI model that's coming out that generates video. Definitely been very hyped. But there was I think it was a filmmaker who got early access. They gave access to a bunch of early previews of the tool and allowed people to create stuff with it. And so there was a competition that they did. They showed all the videos. And I think it still has a little bit of a ways to go before it's everything and before you really have the control and fidelity to do a whole movie in AI. But it's already here for a lot of use cases that really, really cut down on the cost of making a movie, reduce the barrier to entry for a lot of indie filmmakers to do bigger ideas and have that space station in their sci-fi movie when they might not have the money to do anything that doesn't look like it's in the garage. I think we're really, really close to that. And you could argue that the bar, if you lower the bar enough on quality, that we're already there.
Yeah. Well, and I think the reason I bring that up is because that as I was looking into that and seeing like my own thoughts on that, is I was like, oh my gosh, we are so much closer to being able to create this kind of content that like a year, 2 years ago, I would have thought like, it's going to be decades.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden you're like, it's not going to be that long before
Yeah.
we're going to start seeing some of that.
No, it's coming.
I'm going to put you in the hot seat.
Okay.
So, two versions of the same question. From a strictly artistic, creative perspective, what AI tools that are out there are you most excited about right now? And from a enterprise level or from a business perspective, if you are, as a business owner, what are the tools that are you most excited to see how people start to leverage?
Sure. From a creative perspective, I probably am very, very excited about the film making stuff that's coming out. I think we're at an interesting point where image generation technology is getting really, really good, right? Like it's definitely one of the technologies that's there where you can see immediate application for a lot of what it can do.
Yeah.
I think we're not quite there yet on video, but we're getting there, and I think that's really, really exciting. Music, there's an app that came out last week. I think it's called Udio, but that I would say hit the point where you listen to that and you're like, okay, AI can now make not like perfect great music all the time, but it can make stuff.
Well,
right?
I jumped on there to check that out because you told me, I think it was the day that it came out,
Yeah.
or the day after, and I was already on a wait list. I could scan and listen, but I couldn't make anything yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very interesting. I mean, it's from a creative perspective, the challenge now is how do you build applications that allow creatives and artists to really do what they need to do in order to get that level of creative control to where they can create the thing that's actually good. Because where that tool is, just an example, the model's really fabulous. It's best I've ever heard, right? But the tooling is not something that an artist would use, because an artist wouldn't want to just take 30 seconds of AI output and say, that's my song. They'd probably want to take it, have all of that in a DAW and let them like mold it, shape it, update it, and really get a lot more control over it, right? Like that's what a real musician would want out of a tool like that. It's not there yet. The interface isn't there. It's very simplistic. It's like push button, get music. That space needs someone like an Invoke to come in and provide that level of interface. That's what we do with our tool, is we're providing kind of the full interface for applying that model into your process as a creative, and that's what video is going to need. That's what music is going to need, and I think that's where, from a creative perspective, I'm excited to see the application layer evolve. I think that's where most everyone thinks the next era of this AI technology is really focusing on the human-computer interaction and a lot of that like interface decision making. And I think it's going to be really fascinating to watch that evolve, because I don't think people just want a chatbot for these types of creative tools.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I want to get to your thoughts on the business side of it. But first, I am curious, and maybe it's there and I've just not done my due diligence to find it, but are we at a point yet where we want to create image X in my illustration style, and after you've created it, like not only do I want the image, but I want an Illustrator file of that. I want to be able to get in and manipulate it myself. So in other words, like I want you to get me, I'm gonna here's my sketch, you get me another 70% down the road, now give it back to me and let me finish it my way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is, what exactly are you looking for? Are you looking for a vector file? Are you looking for a layered PSD if you're in Photoshop? And the answer to your question is, we're at early stages of both of those. So the vectorized stuff, I think we're starting to see some of that come out, where it just generates a vector file for you, and you can now take that into Photoshop or Illustrator and edit that. From a image generation perspective into Photoshop or a rasterized editor, we're at a point now where there are models that have been trained to generate images with transparency. And so rather than generating the whole image, you're generating one layer of that. And then you can compose that into a Photoshop, right? And so now that the technology's there, any good builders looking at that and saying, oh, it's only a couple of like wire it up a couple different ways, and now we've got a process that generates a full layered file, right? And I think the question again is, what exactly does an artist in that workflow need in order to take it to the next step? Like, what is it that they're looking for? What set of layers? How do they want to iterate it on it with AI? And how do they want to iterate on it in Photoshop? And that's kind of the questions those are the questions we're asking as we watch people use our product, which is like, what problems do we really need to solve? Because the challenge is, there's this historical way of doing things that may not be the same as where it's going. And so we're trying to figure out what of this like problem space is going to remain for us to solve, and where should we just be asking a better question of what does it need to look like tomorrow, right? And then kind of focusing on that. So, yeah, I mean, we're at the early stages of that, but I wouldn't expect to wait too much longer to have this kind of like very easy back and forth between the tools that you're used to and then these new AI generation tools.
I diverted our conversation there, but from a business perspective, what tools are you most excited about, the implications that they could have for companies out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I think about it, you've got a business that's generating value for customers in their own special way. Every business has a different value stream, right? So like you've got Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A makes great chicken sandwiches, and that's the value. The value is that the moment those hash browns hit my lips, right? That's the value I get from it. Love it. How do they build technology that enables them to accelerate that or make that better? Reduce costs in operating that business, whatever it is. How do they operate better as an organization using AI? I think you can look across the organization and say, there are places where we could use images, maybe ads and creative. Maybe there are places where we could operate more effectively, use large language models. For me, the interesting part of the business opportunity is really contextual to every business. I think like if you as an operator are looking at the business that you're running and you're looking at it really at a fundamental value level, what do we do to generate value for our customers? And you're asking about how you re-architect your business to leverage these tools. I think that's the conversation that's going on in most organizations right now.
Sure.
Is at a very high level, they're like, how do we grapple with this new way that we might do things? In that world, I think the most interesting probably piece of it is not just the large language model, but the system that evolves internally to an organization that has that large language model at its core. Because again, these are not AI entities that sit in the organization and go free and run free. It is part of your technology stack. It's part of an integrated process that is your business, just the same way that like any organization who actually understands technology has integrated it into their business and how they deliver value in a different way than this is our IT organization, right? And they send us laptops. Like that's not a tech-enabled organization. When you really are looking at how technology drives value for the business, it's the same type of lens that you're looking at AI through. And I think that's where looking at that integration piece and all of the stuff that allows these to tie into your existing business processes, operate and kind of serve as that kind of like interpretation point where you don't need a fixed set of business logic, but you now have this kind of like interpreter that is sitting there and doing its inference and kind of operating inside of the business. That is where I think from an operator perspective, from a business perspective, that's where the real opportunity is to change how we do business. So that's probably the most exciting opportunity in my mind. But it's like the layer above the large language model, right? Yeah. It's everything that sits above. And maybe this goes back, maybe it's the similar answer to the previous question. It's at the application layer, right? That's what's really interesting with all of this stuff is how does it actually interface with the people of the company?
Yeah, I know we're coming up on time, so I don't want to hold us, but I've I have really enjoyed the conversation, and I would love to be able to do this again down the road, just because I know that 6 months from now, the landscape is going to have evolved and look very different than it does even today. So if you're open to it, I'd love to have you back once we get a little further down the road and see what all has changed.
We'll be in a different world. I might not even be human anymore. I'll be completely roboticized.
Alien Gary's going to be running the world. Yeah. So Kent, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And again, if you haven't had a chance to check it out, you can see even more content around Kent's Tech Talk on our YouTube channel that's available now. And again, if you like what you heard on this episode, go back, check out some of our previous episodes. There's a lot of good content out there. So Kent, thank you once again, and we'll look forward to having you back.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for joining us on Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. If you would like to know more about how Method can partner with you and your organization, you can find more information at method.com. Also, don't forget to follow us on social and be sure to check out our monthly Tech Talks. You can find those on our website. And finally, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any future episodes. We'll see you next time.